Okay, so I want to talk about the May Trump meeting, which is big on the news at the moment. Before I get into that, I'm just going to very briefly discuss two people who've just passed away. Firstly, Tam Dalyell, who was a veteran Labour MP, quite well known in the UK. He was 84. He was from Edinburgh, and he was a long-serving member of Parliament. I believe was the father of the House at one point. Quite left wing, but he developed the notion of the West Lothian question, which is very important in terms of the British Union. So that is basically the notion that it is unfair that Scottish MPs can vote on matters that affect English constituencies, but English MPs cannot vote on matters that affect Scottish constituencies. So he raised that issue. He was probably more left wing than myself, but he was a staunch unionist and was opposed to devolution because he felt it would lead to these independence debacles we're currently seeing. So perhaps he was ahead of his time in that sense. So rest in peace, Tam DL. And secondly, John Hurt. John Hurt, the actor, one of Britain's finest actors. One of the roles I actually remember John Hurt in is in Rob Roy, which was 1995 historic drama about the outlaw Robert Roy McGregor, and he played the Machiavellian Lord Montrose in that. Very, very good at the role, quite a character. Um, he also was in V for Vendetta and numerous other productions, some 200 screen appearances in total. So, very accomplished actor. He has sadly passed away at the age of 77. Anyway, with May and Trump, there's a lot to be said. I'm going to try and keep this to basics. Firstly, a quick word about the special relationship. This concept of a special relationship sort of goes back to the end of the Second World War. Certainly, there would have been some level of communication between prime ministers and presidents before that, but it was really Churchill and Roosevelt that began this in a significant way. I mean, as far as I know, David Lloyd George and Woodrow Wilson didn't have major direct communication during World War One, although they were two of the major World War One leaders. Um, so World War Two, Winston Churchill, Franklin D. Roosevelt, two giants of the 20th century, um, began this concept of a special relationship. Of course, Stalin was the third person in the big three, but that's quite a different story because he was Stalin and a communist dictator. Um, when Roosevelt passed away and Churchill lost the election, then that went on to Clement Attlee and Harry Truman, who were not quite the grandiose characters who had preceded them. Little bit further in time, John F. Kennedy and Harold Macmillan. In some ways, I think Kennedy sort of saw Macmillan as almost a father figure. Macmillan was a good bit older than Kennedy. He was in his 60s. Kennedy, of course, was in his 40s. They had a very good relationship, and both leaders offered sort of optimistic vision, at least Harold Macmillan in his early tenure, not so much by the early 60s, but we sort of remember Macmillan in Britain as Super Mac and You've Never Had It So Good. And then Kennedy, of course, The New Frontier. So they were they had a very good relationship, although the fact that Kennedy was a Democrat and Macmillan a conservative didn't seem to matter very much, which is actually often the case. Generally speaking, the Democratic Party and the Labour Party are sister parties, the Conservative Party and the Republicans, but it's not always that straightforward as my list will show. Then, a bit further in time, going forward a few decades to Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, of course, very famous relationship, Ronnie and Maggie, first name basis. They had their disagreements, but very strong relationship, mutual respect. When Ronald Reagan died in 2004, Thatcher gave a very strong eulogy to him. Um, then, of course, there was John Major and George Bush Sr. Major and Bush Sr. were close because of the first Gulf War, and they were both conservatives. Major made one big mistake, though, and that was openly backing Bush in the American election. Ever since then, prime ministers have been careful because what happened? Bill Clinton won the election, and suffice to say, Clinton and Major had a slightly cold relationship. A bit forward in time, Tony Blair becomes Prime Minister in 1997, which was in Clinton's second term. Ideologically, they were quite similar, both centrists. Clinton had come up with the New Democrats. Blair was presiding over New Labour, so ideologically they were bedfellows. One of the most surprising relations in all of this was Bush and Blair. So Clinton left office. After 9/11, Blair made it clear that he was going to be very close to the United States, and ideologically, he got very close to the Bush doctrine. This was interesting because they came from very different backgrounds. Tony Blair came from a left wing party. George Bush came from a right wing party. Bush was, a conservative Texan. Tony Blair was a centrist Scot, although in British terms he's sort of seen as a bit ambiguous in that regard. But that was certainly one of the most interesting of the special relationship setups. In Britain, it's also probably the most controversial because Blair had always been seen as something of a lapdog to George Bush, fairly or unfairly. He was always portrayed as Bush's poodle, more so than the other relations, because Blair at times seemed almost subservient. Like he would be willing to say yes to almost anything, more so than the other prime ministers. Um, then after Blair, Brown succeeded Blair, but he wasn't in office for very long, less than 3 years. So he never had a really long time to develop a strong bond. Cameron and Obama, I think it's fair to say, was quite a strong relationship. Um, there were differences, of course, in terms of the approach to Libya and other issues, but Cameron and Obama. And then we get to May and Trump. Um, Now, you'll notice there's been a few presidents and prime ministers I haven't included in that. Harold Wilson, Alec Douglas Home, Ted Heath, Jim Callahan on the presidential side, Lyndon Johnson, Richard Nixon, Gerald Ford, and Jimmy Carter. It's not that they had no dialogue, but it's just that either the incumbents were in office for a relatively short time and so didn't have a great length of time to develop strong relations, or they were they just never quite had the same rapport. For example, Harold Wilson and Lyndon Johnson, as far as I know, got on relatively well, but Wilson deliberately chose not to drag us into Vietnam, which he very easily could have done. He even faced criticism for that, for simply being friendly with Johnson, even though they strongly disagreed on the Vietnam policy. Heath and Nixon got on well, but Heath was always a bit awkward with everyone. It was in his personality. Um, Jerry Ford was in office for a very short time. Callahan and Carter, I know Jimmy Carter came to Newcastle in the late 70s. Jim Callahan was obviously there. So that's just a quick rundown of the special relationship over the past sort of just over half a century. Donald Trump and Theresa May. Well, suffice to say, Trump is a controversial figure in Britain, as he is in much of the world. I do want to clear up one misunderstanding though. A while back there was a petition in the UK to sort of ensure that Trump wouldn't visit the UK. Some conservative outlets in the US were saying Trump had been banned from the UK. That's not the case. In the UK, the British government can determine someone a persona non grata. This was the case for some other former heads of government. Narendra Modi in India was on the blacklist because of his involvement with the Gujarat riots and the perception that he hadn't done enough to protect Muslims in those very bloody riots in 2002. Um, but now Narendra Modi is Prime Minister of India and he made a state visit last year. So politics can change very fast. Um, and that was just a petition. It did have a lot of signatures, so it was debated in Parliament. But realistically, the President of the United States isn't going to be banned from the UK, no matter how controversial that president is. There has been controversies before. When George Bush visited, there was a lot of anti-war sentiment in the UK. There were protests. In fact, Bush visited Tony Blair's Sedgefield constituency, which is only about 15 miles from where I live, and there were protests on that occasion. So Bush was a very controversial figure in Britain. It's interesting, Bush is almost being sidelined now because Trump is so controversial. But Theresa May is a pragmatic politician. And that's the impression I always get from her. She's a pragmatist, she's level headed, and she's something of a technocrat. This can sometimes give the impression that she's a bit cold, a bit bureaucratic. I think actually, in some ways, it's a strength that she's not overly excitable, not overly prone to being very partisan in terms of relationships with people. For example, in Britain, she was asked would she push Trump on, the Access Hollywood tape, this sort of thing. Theresa May said that she was absolutely appalled by that, but she's also went out of her way to emphasize that there is a lot in common with the United States. And I think the message that she's trying to send out is sort of twofold. Firstly, the British American relationship transcends individual presidents and prime ministers. And secondly, we have to be realistic. And I think whenever there's issues about a leader's personality or human rights issues or anything like that, and it's interesting, I'm talking about human rights here, but I'm talking about the United States. I'm not talking about China or Saudi Arabia or somewhere like that. We're talking about one of our oldest allies and closest countries culturally, politically, in every sense. The concerns lie in some of the things that Trump has said and his disturbing positions on torture. A lot of these things came up at the meeting. Now, before the meeting, Theresa May addressed a Republican um, meeting in Philadelphia that went down very well from what I could see. In Washington, in the White House, one thing that was notable about this joint press conference was how brief it was, one of the briefest I've ever seen. Only 18 minutes. Trump spoke for, it must have been just over a minute. May spoke for about, I guess, 5 to 7 minutes. Very brief. So either they hadn't got off as well as they would like to imply, and they didn't have a great deal to say, or they were keeping it brief because there was other business to attend to. I don't know what that is. A lot of things were discussed. Laura Kuenssberg of the BBC, who's a very direct sort of journalist, she's got both fans and dissenters. She went straight for the jugular and said, people in the UK, or some people in the UK, are uncomfortable with some of Trump's positions, etc., etc., etc. I think May gave very, typical, on one hand, typical politician answers, sort of not directly answering, saying that we will listen to each other, there will be times we disagree. So she sort of didn't answer quite directly. Um, on the question of NATO, which is very important, they seem to digress somewhat. Um, because on the Russia question, May said she was very insistent that we believe in keeping up sanctions against Russia unless Putin respects the terms of the Minsk agreement for peace in Ukraine. So May was quite independent with that. That's something that, people can't accuse her of being subservient. She did make that very clear that that was our position. Donald Trump basically said, "Oh, I don't know Putin. I don't know the guy. We'll see what happens." The problem is you can't really sit on the fence with someone like Putin. And I must say, it's one of my biggest concerns about Trump, just how cozy he is with Russia. Now, of course, it is good if two of the world's most powerful countries get on. But the problem I have with Trump's position on Russia isn't that he's trying to reach out and have better relations. You can't fault someone for that. Rather, it's that he is openly, both during the campaign and recently, basically endorsed Putin's lies and Russian propaganda on, for example, the Syria crisis. Trump has basically endorsed the Russian line that any Syrian fighting Assad must be a terrorist. This is dangerous rhetoric, and more importantly, is simply inaccurate. And it does trouble me that Trump is very willing to just basically buy into Russia Today propaganda, and he doesn't even seem to realize it. Um, so that has many critics, not just the Democrats. Many Republicans are critical of that. Both leaders are not afraid to use the word Islamist. That's important. On NATO, one point that was interesting in the speech was when the joint press conference was when May kind of, in a sense, nudged Trump and said, I think the president agrees that we need to maintain NATO. So it's almost like she was reiterating that to reassure people at home. What I would say to people, this is getting a lot of ridicule at home and within the States. From the British point of view, what I would say to my fellow Britons is put yourself in Theresa May's shoes. I do understand that we need to make sure that we're not lapdogs of Trump's America. Um, it is important that May speaks up on issues like Russia, like Putin, um, and other issues that are very important. I mean, torture, for me, it's just a no go. There's no moral justification for torture, and you don't have to be a bleeding heart liberal to see that. I mean, John McCain is hardly on the political left, and he's opposed to torture because these Islamist scumbags, they might well deserve it, but as soon as we start using their tactics, then we lose the propaganda war, and that is a major issue because then we're just doing exactly the same thing as them. So one issue that many people wanted May to bring up, um, I shouldn't say many people, what some people wanted May to bring up was to push Trump on the existence of so-called CIA black sites, that is, whereby terror suspects would basically be tortured outside the rules of the Geneva Convention. We cannot be party to that. And this is not about being soft on terrorism. It's about, you see, the Trump line on this is play their game. And on one hand, I see what he means because ISIS isn't a conventional army. They are rats, as he put it. They're cards, they're rats. They don't fight like a conventional army. But I still think torture has to be a no go because, for a start, a confession extracted under torture is not reliable because someone, this goes back centuries. If someone's in excruciating pain, they will say anything to make it stop. So it's not reliable evidence anyway. And they could well implicate an innocent person simply to to get themselves off the hook. So I think it's very, very flawed as a method. That doesn't mean I think that, you should sit down with terrorists and have a cup of tea. I do believe in robust interrogation, but not torture. Now, there's a lot of issues to do with trade tariffs and so on, and I think we need to be realistic. We're leaving the European Union. We need to look to other major powers. Now, the United States is already a major trading partner. I believe it's fourth or fifth in terms of our biggest trading partners. I believe Ireland is first, then the Netherlands, Germany, something like that. China is also quite a big trade partner. But this is of mutual interest for Trump's America. If Trump continues this isolationist, protectionist route, I understand why that's politically popular and I understand some of the argument for it. But the problem is then other powers like China then fill the gap. Now, from the British perspective, we have to be realistic. We are leaving the EU. It's true that Hollande and Merkel are not comfortable about this, but in the end of the day, this is Britain, and May's job is to represent the people of Britain and what she feels is the best deal with that. I do believe she is in a strong position because she was a Remainer. Trump is pro Brexit, as he said, he was in Scotland at the time. Um, he also made a quip about he was in serious Scotland in true Trump fashion. That's his background. Anyway, all in all, it was a very interesting meeting. This is, by the way, the headline from the I newspaper. May's tricky trip to the US from a few days ago, so this pretty much sums it up. There's a lot more that could be said about this. On the question of Mexico, obviously, there's very tense relations now between Trump and Peña Nieto. May gave a very diplomatic answer that it was basically none of her business. That was between the American and Mexican governments. So a lot of issues there. I don't think the special relationship is going to, evaporate. And when I say special relationship, I'm under no illusions that there are differences. There will be differences. But I think any Briton who thinks that we could just ignore the world's most powerful country, and it's popular to do two fingers to America, but it's just not realistic. May can be assertive and stand up to Trump when necessary. As she pointed out, the whole nature of a special relationship is it makes it easier to be candid. So people who just want us to have no relationship with Trump's America are deluded. That isn't going to happen. It's just not reality. We have to be realistic. Okay, thanks for watching. Let me know your thoughts.